Have you ever wondered why Russian soldiers don't rebel, even when their commanders treat them as expendable? That's the question we'll explore in this video, by diving into Russia's military culture to understand this disturbing phenomenon. 2. Give you a sense of how serious the situation is. More Russian soldiers have died in this war than in all of Russia's other post-World War II conflicts combined. So, why don't most of them resist? Our Ukrainian soldiers describe waves of poorly armed and barely trained Russian troops being thrown into combat as cannon fodder. This tactic results in extreme levels of death and injury among the invading forces. At the same time, Russian troops have been reported committing horrific violence, not only against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war, but also against each other. So I'll ask again, why do Russian soldiers, treated as disposable by their own commanders, comply with and even participate in such brutality with so little resistance? Violence between fellow soldiers isn't unique to the Russian military, but the scale of abuse in the Russian ranks is almost unprecedented in recent decades, while soldiers in other conflicts have disobeyed orders or even rebelled, like fragging. Officers during the Vietnam War, this kind of defiance is largely absent among Russian troops. What we're seeing in the invasion of Ukraine, widely documented online, reveals a deeply rooted culture of violence inside Russia's armed forces. 1. That creates a brutal cycle of coercion and complicity. Several theories try to explain why Russian soldiers don't rebel. Some point to financial incentives, signing bonuses that exceed annual incomes in certain regions, above average military wages, and large payouts to families of fallen soldiers. Others turn to cultural or ideological explanations, arguing that fatalism and nihilism are embedded in Russian society. Some analysts suggest that for many soldiers, the war offers a twisted sense of purpose or masculinity, allowing impoverished men at the bottom of society to emerge as national heroes, ready for ultimate sacrifice. But while financial and ideological motivations may explain why Russians enlist, they don't fully explain the continued obedience in the face of systemic abuse and inhumane tactics. Despite some desertions, though we don't know the real numbers, most Russian soldiers remain passive in the face of high death rates, poor equipment, and relentless mistreatment. Why? Because this obedience is enforced through a culture of internal violence, one that becomes part of a soldier's very identity. Brutality is normalized from day one. Through repeated exposure to violence, whether as victim or perpetrator, soldiers learn to accept it as part of military life. Many armies use controlled aggression in training to build toughness and unit cohesion. The British Army's Parachute Regiment, for example, has a ritual called milling, where recruits repeatedly punch each other in the head. But in Russia, this goes much further. A particularly cruel tradition known as Dedovshchina has been institutionalized. In their first months of mandatory service, Russian conscripts are subjected to extreme hazing. This includes beatings, extortion, and even sexual abuse by older soldiers, sometimes under the supervision of officers. There are reports of recruits being prostituted by superiors. One notorious case in the 2000s involved a soldier who was so badly beaten that both his legs and genitals had to be amputated. In 2018, a conscript took his own life after a slur was carved into his forehead with a razor blade, just like the scene in Inglourious Basterds. Human rights activists believe many so-called suicides in the Russian military are actually homicides linked to abuse and extortion. In 2019, a soldier in Siberia opened fire on his own unit, killing 8, claiming he'd been pushed to the edge by relentless abuse. And this culture persists today, even as many soldiers are rushed to the front lines without undergoing full training or experiencing the full hazing cycle. But more importantly, violence within the ranks remains a primary tool of control. Russia still uses Soviet-style tactics like barrier troops, units placed behind their own soldiers, with orders to shoot anyone who tries to retreat. Those who complain or refuse orders are thrown into punishment pits, sent to makeshift detention centers, or executed on the spot by their own commanders. Drunk soldiers have murdered civilians and even each other, and most of this violence happens with little to no accountability. When soldiers are executed, their deaths are often disguised, as combat losses or desertions. The use of violence against Russian soldiers creates a cycle where brutality becomes normalized and internalized, making rebellion seem unthinkable. Fear, resignation, and the internalization of violence become core aspects of a soldier's worldview. For generations, both the Soviet and Russian armies have used fear and violence to enforce obedience against enemies, civilians, and even their own recruits. Some soldiers don't just tolerate this violence, they actively embody it. Units accused of war crimes in places like Bucha are often publicly praised and decorated by the Russian government. This only reinforces the normalization of cruelty. Conditioned by a brutal military culture, many Russian soldiers are trapped in a cycle of violence from which few can escape. This has major implications for the ongoing war in Ukraine, now in its fourth year. First, since high casualty rates haven't led to widespread disobedience, Russia is likely to continue its strategy of attrition, sending wave after wave of disposable troops. Second, we can expect continued systematic repression and abuse of Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war, as seen in Bucha, Irpin, and countless survivor testimonies. Rather than weakening the soldiers' will, the violence enforced by Russian commanders only deepens the cycle turn. So if you want real-time updates and in-depth breakdowns of events like this, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss our next videos. See you next time.